Um, I would like to introduce Scott Bradley. And Scott is a great podcast, I guess you'd say author, broadcaster, whatever. And he does a lot of horror things, and he does Hellbent for horror. And hopefully we will be able to show it to you today. And I'm going to let him give a little bit more of an introduction of himself. Let's get going.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody who's shown up. I'm sorry we're a little bit late. We had some technical difficulties, as one might expect with Zoom. But I am S.A. Bradley, and I'm overjoyed to say hello to you folks, my people, horror fans, and those that aren't quite horror fans, but may be horror fans if they're curious enough. And I'm really here as an ambassador for horror. I'm here to remind you used to love horror movies. You secretly still do. And I am the author of the book, Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm also the podcaster and public speaker for Hellbent for Horror. And basically that is a podcast that talks about all things horror, all things creepy crawly. And I take that and put it into the context of social life. So how has horror actually changed the culture itself, and how has culture changed the things that we look at as being scary? So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to do a little bit of what would normally be a seminar that I would give live, basically talking with you and showing some slides and interacting with you. We're here on Zoom, not quite the same. What I did is I made a hopefully entertaining movie about an hour long, that goes through what I call my horror manifesto. I love to say that horror does not deserve your shame, and it is kind of the redheaded stepchild of genre. Genre in the first place kind of gets a little bit of a short shrift. We love to talk about drama as if drama is at this higher level, but the reality is all storytelling is valid, all storytelling is important, and every piece of storytelling it works on a certain need that we have. So horror and the idea of being scared, or the idea of laughing, or the idea of releasing through tears, whatever it is, there is a specific story that allows us to feel those emotions in a safe and wonderful way. And horror might be in the dark alleys, but at the same point, it is just as valid as anything else. But we do have this thing where for some strange reason, maybe it's because we're a little bit nervous about taking a look at ourselves in that deep, dark, truthful mirror, we don't want to talk about those emotions at the same level as others. There are no good emotions. There are no bad emotions. There are just emotions. What we do with those emotions is the big thing. And I think that horror itself as a genre, as a storytelling style, has been with us forever, and it has held on to a part of us that needs to be expressed and needs to be done as safely as possible. And so without any further ado, what I'll do is I'll start up our thing. Hopefully it will work. And if not, hey, I have a gift of gab. I can talk about this for the amount of time that we need to in case the technical difficulties become big. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to start the film. And thank you. And at the end, I'm more than happy to gab about my favorite topic. So let's see here. Sharing.
Welcome everybody to a special presentation of my Horror Manifesto. I'm S.A. Bradley and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to the horror film. And I am here to spread the gospel about the most beautiful genre of them all. I'm here to celebrate the greatness of horror with fellow horror fans, my people. But I'm also here to remind everyone else that they used to love horror movies, and they secretly still do. Because even though it is one of the oldest and most diverse storytelling styles that we have, horror still suffers from a long-standing stigma. It's still dismissed as a lesser art form, or as an embarrassment, or even as a dangerous or harmful influence upon society. But horror doesn't only have to contend with the critics and the detractors. Writers and directors who make horror movies distance themselves from the genre once their movie gets mainstream praise. And then there's the infighting among horror fans themselves. There are the gatekeepers who want to define what is and what isn't a real horror movie for everybody else. And then there are the people who love the thrill of horror, but they have to create new genre labels so they don't have to admit they actually watch horror movies. That's a whole lot of negative noise that horror has to endure. And that's all it is, noise. And that's why I made this manifesto, to cut through the noise and show the value of horror. Because the horror story performs a valuable service to culture and to humanity. It allows us a visceral exploration of what makes us human. It allows us a safe place to confront our inner demons, and even lets us confront monsters that are inside of our own culture. Horror is universal, and it is here for all of us. There is a horror story tailor-made for everybody out there. And despite all the slings and arrows that get thrown at it, horror will be there for us when we desperately need it. Horror does not deserve your shame, and I'm here to tell you why. Now, that begs the question, who the hell am I? Well, first and foremost, I'm a lifelong fan. I spent around a half-century in a torrid love affair with a horror film. I've watched thousands of movies, and I've read hundreds of books. And a few years back, I found that I couldn't stay a spectator any longer. I needed to pay forward the joy I had for the horror genre, and so I became a creator. Since 2016, I've been the host of the Hellbent for Horror podcast. And on that podcast, I talk about everything related to horror. I talk about horror as art and as social commentary. And I talk about the movies, the books, the stories, even the music that shape me, and how those stories shape horror as a film style and as an art form. I'm also the author of Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. Now, that book is a love letter to all things that go bump in the night, and how horror not only reinvents itself to reflect each generation's anxieties, but it can also be healing as well as it is thrilling. So, healing, right? How is it healing? Well, it's not going to cure your lumbago, all right? I don't advise getting off your heart medicine and watching Friday the 13th marathons instead. I'm talking about emotional healing. It's those little things that mean a lot. Horror is a safe way to acknowledge and indulge those dark parts of us that we all have inside of us, the parts that we don't really want to look at. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung called this dark part the shadow self. And we all have that dark side. It battles with the personae, which is the mask we show the rest of society, so we can belong. Jung also says that the more someone ignores the shadow self, the darker and more powerful that shadow self gets. Hey, you can choose to ignore your shadow, but it is at your own peril. Sooner or later, that shadow will get your attention, whether you like it or not. And when it decides to get your attention, that's when you get divorced, or you declare bankruptcy, or you do something absolutely crazy that you land on TMZ. There is good news, though. Jung says that there is light within the shadow, positive healing light, if you're willing to go find it. The key to the search for your shadow is that you want to acknowledge the shadow, you just don't want to become it. See, I consider the horror film a safe way to have a handshake with our shadow. Now, I know I may be in the minority here, but I'm someone who actually feels better after watching a horror movie. Horror puts me in a better mood. Nothing takes the edge off a stressful day better than watching someone getting decapitated by an axe murderer. When I'm feeling a little depressed, nothing blows away the blues like hearing the screams of an unlucky hunter while he's being torn to shreds by mutated bears. Just the thought of someone unable to start their car engine while their undead relative smacks the windshield with a hammer drops my anxiety levels to a manageable spot. Hey, I'm just a regular guy. One of the things I think that makes horror so special is that it works on our unconscious minds. It works on the emotions that we can't articulate. Those times when, if someone sees that you're troubled and they ask you what's wrong and all you can say is, that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. We don't know why we're feeling the way we're feeling. We just do. Something in our subconscious is eating away at us. And horror gets past the defenses of that logical part of the brain, and it goes right to the emotional side. Because you know what? That logic side might just be part of the problem at the time. I think horror works a lot like music does. Have you ever been in a really bad mood and you turn on some music and you hear a song that you love, and just like that, your mood changes? Same with me. Do you have different go-to songs for different moods? So do I. The right song can change your mood with just one chord. I have different go-to horror movies for different moods, by the way. Now, here are some images from my go-to horror movies. Now, I cannot tell you why these movies are special to me. I just know that they are. Those movies have unique personal emotional connections with me, just like music does. Music can change your mood in one chord, and horror can change your mood with one shot. Like music, horror is primal, and it works in the unconscious mind. It's that place where logic fears to tread. If we're honest, that's how most art works. We feel it long before we start thinking about what it is that we're seeing. Like when you're looking at a painting. Say you go to a gallery and you stand in front of a painting and you stare at it for a little bit of time. Well, you're going to attract the attention of a salesman or the owner. And that owner's going to stand next to you. And what does he say? So how does it make you feel? See, it doesn't matter if you know art theory. It doesn't matter if you know how to paint. Art can still affect you emotionally. Art doesn't need to be logical. It doesn't have to make logical sense to be powerful, but it can't exist without emotional connection. And that's why I see horror as one of the most beautiful art forms we have, because it is all about emotional connection. After all, it's the only genre named after an emotion. It's also one of the oldest and most versatile storytelling styles that we have. It is tailor-made for allegory and metaphor and parable. It allows us to talk about uncomfortable subjects that we'd never sit and watch in a straight drama. It allows us an artistic detachment from the uncomfortable subject in front of us. We get to have a visceral exploration of what it means to be human. It gives us a safe place to confront our own monsters, the ones that just can't be ignored. I think the horror story has always been with us, and it has always performed an important function for us. I like to say that horror is the second story told. So you're telling stories, say around the first campfire ever, and the elder is there with the tribe, and then there's the first story, and the first story goes something like this. Thank you, earth. Thank you, air. Thank you, wood. Thank you for the first fire. Thank you, fire and food. Thank you, animals, for food and companionship. We are all family here. Thank you for being here with me. We can stay warm. We can stay wonderful in the brightness. We are strong together. And then comes the second story, which is, whatever you do, do not go into those woods. There are horrible things in those woods. Stick with us. The second story is the cautionary tale. The second story is about the shadow. The second story is the horror story. And that cautionary tale says a lot about your tribe. Horror is ancient. Why has it endured so long? It endures because deep down we need it. It's not a social need. It's not a cultural need. It's a human need. Sometimes we need a stand-in boogeyman when we feel helpless against the real ones in the world. Sometimes we need to have a sense of control over being scared because this real world is scary. And you know what? Sometimes we just need to watch someone else kill their boss so we don't have to kill our own. Because real life problems have a heavy weight attached to them. But a horror movie can never hurt you. Part of the joy of a horror film is you get to defeat fear. Horror cannot scare you the same way twice. Once you see it, the fear gets transformed into a thrill. The fear is temporary, and there is power in facing our fears. And those are some of the reasons that I believe horror has important cultural value. Those are reasons that I say horror can make us happy and healthy, because there is power in confronting our fears safely. And horror stories are made to give you that power. And sometimes a horror film does this so well that it can make the horrible somehow beautiful, so that its special power can't be denied. And it becomes embraced by mainstream audiences and critics alike. Those special moments in horror history have been happening since the birth of cinema, and they have been happening steadily every year for decades. And if you look closely, It really is a beautiful time to watch horror movies. However, there's almost always at least one movie in the slideshow that I just had that makes someone come up to me afterwards and say, hey, you know what? I love insert whichever movie it is, but it's not a horror movie. In fact, there may be at least one of you right now who want a movie taken off the horror list that I just showed. Now, I think part of the reason people challenge the horror label for certain films is that it's not easy to define what makes a horror film in the first place. Saying it's a movie that scares you for entertainment value is pretty vague, because what scares one person may not scare another person. It can be very subjective, and personal opinion and taste and experience can color your definition. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart famously defined pornography by saying, I know it when I see it. I find that people who don't like horror films judge the entire genre by the film they hate, and horror fans tend to think the entire genre should be like the one movie that they absolutely love. Now, both of these are extremes, and both extremes are very limiting. And if the definition of horror is limited, it is easy to pigeonhole it to the lowest common denominator. And that lowest common denominator is where the social stigma around horror gets all of its energy. Because the detractors of horror, they have no problems at all promoting their own definition. Me, what about a definition that I have? I like to keep it simple. I go to the dictionary. Now, the dictionary definition of horror is an intense feeling of shock, dread, repulsion, or terror. So a horror movie tells a story that gives the viewer an intense feeling of shock, dread, repulsion, or terror. The definition needs to be loose because what it takes to give each viewer those intense feelings is very subjective. But there's a follow-up question that I think we need to ask ourselves that's equally important, and that is the why. Why, out of all of the different film styles that they could choose from, did the director choose to tell their story using horror elements? Was it used to show the presence of evil in a relatively just world, or was it used to show what the world would look like if evil went unchecked? I think it's important to try and figure out what emotions the artist wanted the audience to go home with, because Walt Disney's Bambi has 2 sequences in it that scared generations of kids, but I would never call it a horror film. The intentions of the filmmakers matter. Let me give you an example of how intentions matter. In other words, what the filmmaker wants you to feel and how that matters. Let's take 2 films that came out around the same time in the mid-'80s, and they both discussed the same topic. 2 movies that wouldn't normally be considered horror films. They are Oliver Stone's Platoon and Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Both movies are set during the Vietnam War, but they have very different tones and very different things to say. One is a war film, and the other is a horror movie disguised as a war movie. Platoon is based on Oliver Stone's actual experiences in Vietnam, and the movie does feel like it could be a documentary at times. Platoon is a pretty realistic, gritty, and pretty intense narrative. The theme of Platoon is summed up by the tagline that's on the movie poster. The first casualty of war is innocence. In other words, the tragedy of war is that it corrupts good men. Platoon focuses on the human tragedy of war. It empathizes with Vietnam veterans at a time when America ignored them during the 80s. Platoon wanted to help heal America's wounds from Vietnam. Stanley Kubrick was having none of that. Full Metal Jacket wasn't about group hugs or coming to terms with our mistakes. Full Metal Jacket has a very different message, and the message of the movie is written directly on a helmet. Born to kill. In other words, there's a killer in every man, and war is where the psychos come out to play. Where Oliver Stone strives for realism in Platoon, Stanley Kubrick goes an entirely different route. He mixes a war movie with surrealism and satire, and he creates a modern German expressionism horror film in the process. If you want to talk about what makes a horror movie, it is important to talk about German expressionism. Now, German expressionism and horror are kissing cousins, and they have been since the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu back in the 1920s. German expressionism took the dark, internal emotions of the characters and brought them externally into the visuals. The characters in the cabin of Dr. Caligari live in a world that is dominated by madness. Their fear and their internal paranoia were literally painted externally right on the scenery itself. And Stanley Kubrick goes full metal Caligari. Stanley Kubrick creates a horror movie universe for us to walk through. Now, what is a horror movie universe, you may ask? Well, a horror movie universe is a certain way of telling a story. It's where nothing works. The system is falling apart. Everything is broken. You are alone and helpless. Nobody is happy. Nobody is helpful. It's almost always dark. Every institution that there is that's supposed to help you is going to fail you. Everything in the story is in service to a mood, and that mood is doom. Everything points to entropy. The universe needs to be like this in a horror film. The universe needs to be insane. It needs to be insane for us to believe that the insane choices that the characters are going to make are the only rational ones. In Full Metal Jacket, we only know the horror movie world that Stanley Kubrick wants us to know. There's no backstory to the vicious drill instructor. He just is, as if he has always been. There are no warm scenes of male bonding like there were in Platoon. The closest we get to male bonding is when we get to see one of the Marines sharing a beer with a dead Viet Cong soldier. Kubrick isn't interested in innocence. He's interested in the killers. He wants you to see how killers get made. Nothing else in this horror movie universe exists. Kubrick uses that horror movie world to give us a sequence in Full Metal Jacket that's scarier than anything in The Shining, in my opinion. It's a psychotic break of Private Pile. The sequence takes place in the latrine, lit only by silver moonlight through the windows. The only special effect is actor Vincent D'Onofrio's face in close-up, and that stark lighting. The sequence could be from a silent movie by F.W. Murnau. You can turn off the volume and still know what's happening. Now, if you don't think this is a horror movie sequence, then ask yourself, why doesn't anybody just turn on the fucking latrine lights? They're bright fluorescents. Well, because Stanley Kubrick knew we needed to feel the emotional mood of horror. Of course, it can be argued whether Full Metal Jacket is a horror movie in disguise or not. That's part of the fun of having conversations about horror and emotions in the first place. But we want to talk about the stigma. And where I see the stigma really kick in is when a movie openly courts the horror movie audience, only to deny that it's a horror movie in the long run. And that brings me to Ari Aster's Midsommar. It has a healthy amount of humor and plenty of social satire inside of it, but the movie is also full of slow burn dread that undercuts that humor in every sequence. This movie wants to disturb you. I mean, take a look at it. The movie opens with a scene of pure horror. And then it starts the second act with a scene of pure horror. And then it ends with another scene of pure horror. Midsommar reminds me of horror movies from the 70s, like Roman Polanski's The Tenant and Blood on Satan's Claw, and of course The Wicker Man. Now, it might remind me of those movies, but Midsommar is its own unique beast. And that, in my opinion, makes it an exceptional horror movie. Too bad Ari Aster doesn't consider Midsommar a horror film. When he was interviewed in Filmmaker magazine, he deflected the horror movie epithet by saying, I see the film as a fairy tale more than anything else. Now, I'm not sure what fairy tales Ari Aster was thinking of, but here are a few that feel like horror stories. These are fairy tales that are also horror stories. The Red Shoes. In The Red Shoes, a soldier curses a girl to dance herself to death because of her vanity. These shoes cannot be removed. As she gets closer and closer to death, dancing herself literally to death, she begs the town's executioner to cut off her feet. He obliges. The fairy tale Bluebeard is about a rich and powerful nobleman who marries and murders one wife after another. When his newest wife sneaks into the cellar, she finds her predecessors hanging from meat hooks in a pool of blood from wall to wall. In Hansel and Gretel, parents leave their starving children in the woods to die. The children become the captives of a cannibalistic witch. They are caged, and they are force-fed in order to plump them up so that they can be eaten. These are fairy tales. And by the way, so are these. Now, I'm not saying that all fairy tales are also horror stories, but I am saying that the leap between fairy tale and horror movie is not that far apart. But let's put it this way, why make the change? When you hear the words fairy tale, what do you see in your mind's eye? Chances are you thought of a princess, or a glass slipper, or a Prince Charming. You know, you didn't think of the witches, or the giants, or the trolls, or the big bad wolf in those stories. The words fairy tale conjure up softer and gentler and nicer images than the word horror does, even if grandma still gets eaten by a wolf. And that's what Ari Aster was playing at. He wanted the mainstream audiences to give him a pass for the horrific images in his film, but still indulge in the horrific images. So why the name game? Why is it so hard to just say horror? Because the horror genre carries a lot more baggage than even fairy tales do. There is a long-standing prejudice against the horror genre that continues to this day. Midsummer is just another in a long line of films that reap all the benefits of horror style, but wouldn't be caught dead calling themselves a horror movie. This mindset is an old and outdated preconception. It's a holdover from when film critics Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael ruled the movie world. A handful of critics were responsible for what genres were art and which ones were considered trash. But today, the line between culture and pop culture has blurred. And yet, once a horror film does get critical and box office success, it secretly gets relabeled as another genre, especially if that horror movie gets nominated for an Oscar. In 1990, Misery became a thriller. In 1991, Silence of the Lambs became a psychological thriller. And in 2007, No Country for Old Men became a gothic western. Imagine that. And then, in 2018, something happened at the Oscars that never happened before. Two horror films, Jordan Peele's Get Out and Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, were both nominated for Best Picture. And that means that out of the 275 films that were released in that year, two horror movies beat out all the other movies in all the other genres for Best Picture. There were 17 Oscar nominations between the two of those films. Jordan Peele won Best Original Screenplay for Get Out, and The Shape of Water won Best Picture. Hey, that's a pretty historic night, right? Well, unfortunately, by the time Oscar night came around, both films went through a genre relabeling. The Shape of Water became a fantasy romance, and they created a new genre for Get Out, the social thriller. Social thriller. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Year after year, Hollywood is more than happy to release plenty of horror films and count the money they make. But when it comes to the Oscars, horror movies are considered an embarrassment. It has become, weirdly enough, a time-honored tradition. When Get Out first premiered, it was lauded by critics everywhere as a brilliant horror film. But after it got nominated for 4 Oscars, you couldn't find any articles where the word horror was used to describe Get Out, except for one. Props and respect go out to New York Times critic Jason Zinnemann. He was the lone voice who saw the trend, and he spoke out with a very pointed question. Why are we ashamed to call Get Out and The Shape of Water horror films? It's an even more interesting question when you realize that one of the films was directed by a director renowned for his horror films. Guillermo del Toro is easily one of the most critically acclaimed horror directors in cinema history. He is probably the most acclaimed horror director working today. He's even called the King of the Monsters. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water scored an incredible 13 Oscar nominations, and it won 4, including Best Director for del Toro. But the most amazing thing was that The Shape of Water, a monster movie about the many different types of monsters in the world, won Best Picture. But holy shit, don't call it a monster movie. 4 Oscar statuettes later, his monster movie, his horror movie, is discussed as a fantasy romance that just happens to have a creature in it. So why the name game? Why is it so hard to just say horror? Even after birthing so many great and influential films, the horror genre still carries a stigma. Why is that? Well, let's just get down to it, shall we? People who dismiss horror think of it as simple, as in stupid, uneducated. Movies by dimwits for dimwits. Lacking social or cultural sophistication, it is too shallow to concern itself with social issues or politics or the human condition. It caters to our ugly emotions. It is undignified entertainment of the lowest common denominator. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't horror movies that earn that distinction, but I'm also not here to apologize for horror movies that offend you. Nobody said that horror plays nice, folks. It's not horror's job to share half of its sandwich with you at lunch. But the judgment of worthlessness, this dismissal of value, it is used to define the entire genre. You can hear it in coded messages like, "It's a thinking person's horror film," or "That was surprisingly smart," which implies that horror movies are fundamentally dumb. Consequently, when a horror movie shows greatness that even...
Yeah, hi. I think everybody else is frozen. And I think that Scott just kind of disappeared. And he's probably trying to get back on again. I apologize. Yeah. Oh, he lost power. Oh, that's interesting. Did he let you know that he lost power? Whoa! Whoa! Hey! Hey, hey, hey! Oh, get him away, please. Sorry, I have a cat fight going on.
Wow.
Yes, horror cat fight. Wow. That was interesting.
I leave the door open when you're not here, when the cats aren't here.